Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of the Future Tech Podcast. It's me, Charlie Sell, Board Director at Manger Group, where I get a chance to talk to thought leaders, technical experts, people who just have a passionate about STEM, to find out a bit about their story, get to the nitty gritty of topics that they're especially passionate about, and we always finish in that all important career advice. Really pleased to have Eduard Erwee with me today. Eduard is the technical data lead at Pret Manger. I imagine many of the listeners will know Pret as it's a global food retail outlet throughout the country, but with a very strong technical background for what they need to do across all of the stores. So Eduard's story from entrepreneur and startup through to working for global businesses, it's really quite interesting. So Eduard, welcome to the podcast.
Great, Charlie. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump straight in and tell us a bit about your career. How did you get into tech?
Well, I was going to say, I'm going to try my best not to sound too old, but many moons ago, just before 2000, I kind of finished my university and I went into tech. So I started as a developer, spent roughly about 3 years as a developer on the Microsoft platform. And for those of you who remember, that's roughly the time when Microsoft launched the .NET platform. And a lot of things were changing in development, and we were quite keen, myself and my colleagues, to get into it. But unfortunately, the company that we were working for at the time wouldn't send us on training. So I thought probably the best way to kind of stay up to speed would be to just become an IT trainer myself. So I kind of did the jump from developer to Microsoft certified trainer. And I did that for about 4 years. And that was really an interesting experience, mostly because it paid me a lot less than a developer, which I'll get to at the end of the podcast. But also it really opened up my eyes to a lot more technologies and gave me exposure to a lot more tech that I didn't have access to before. And that was really a good career change, because from there, I was actually then able to move from there to work for Microsoft for 4 years as a SQL Server data engineer. And again, exposing me to a lot more technical background and very smart technical people, allowing me to really grow in my confidence in that area. So I was at Microsoft for roughly 4 years. And then while working in finance, I came across a bunch of guys that I was helping, and I realized that these guys were earning 3 times more money than I was, doing roughly the same thing. I thought, I want to be that guy. So I kind of made the leap from Microsoft to financial services, and had roughly about 7 really interesting years working for a lot of top companies, HSBC, Lloyds Bank, JP Morgan. And again, really just growing my confidence in the area and growing my knowledge of the subject matter that I was specializing in, which was data and data architecture at the time. And really, around about 2016, I thought, you know what, I've always been passionate about startups, but I've never really given it a shot. And I thought, you know what, I've been doing this for 18 years. I know everything. I'm going to go into startups. And wow, was that a trial by fire. And really just from there on, is for the next 8 years, I spent working in a couple of different startups, doing some really interesting things. And then also then in between these gigs, I did some contracting here and there. And that's where, as you mentioned at the moment, I'm at Pret doing data work for them as their technical data lead. And yeah, really having fun. If I'm allowed to do a plug, they do some really great food. I'm sure you guys are all aware. But also something I think they don't shout from the rooftops enough is the fact that they actually make all their food fresh on site every day. So if you haven't had a Pret sandwich, you're missing out.
And I think, why not? That is so good to be happy and proud of the place that you're working at the moment, and that story, as you say, what I love about this podcast is a variety of backgrounds that people have, and it makes sense to me from learning tech to then training to become a trainer to get that exposure, but to then pivot back in and have a 4-year career at Microsoft. That's pretty impressive. I know we spoke before about, one of the things I'm always interested about is that difference from when someone has worked for a huge business like Microsoft versus they've also had the experience of startups. And I know you're quite passionate about the startup world, but also for reasons of how hard it is as well. So talk us through a bit about your startup journey and a bit about the type of businesses you tried setting up and any lessons learned there.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about myself. I'm very passionate about food tech, health tech, mostly because I'm a type 1 diabetic myself. And I constantly run around the issue, or I used to, when I go into a supermarket and picking up 2 yogurts. And as a mildly educated person, really struggling to even figure out which one's better for me because it's all just colors and hype and marketing. And that was when I kind of decided, you know what, I've been doing this IT stuff for a while. Let's try and build an app that can actually do the thinking for me. And that's really where Best in Bag, which was my original startup that I created myself, kind of came from, using a lot of research that was developed by the NHS and kind of taking that research and building some mathematical models on top of that to actually help me set up a profile that I can then use to rate food against and see which option is better for me. So the way it worked is there was an app and you'd go into a supermarket and scan the barcode of your favorite chocolate and define, or based on your custom health profile, it would say, well, actually, of all the chocolates in the same category, this one might be rated 17th. So of 1 to 100, this one's 17th. So very simply, there's 16 other chocolates ranked from 1 to 16 that are better for you, and the order of which they're better for you based on your customized profile. So that chocolate might be 17 for me, it might be 15 for you, it might be 20 for somebody else. And really just kind of take that one-fits-all paradigm away where people, we had these, I remember back at school, we had these charts on the wall that said what you're supposed to eat. And it's funny how this chart was supposed to fit everybody, where literally each one of us have an individual need when it comes to dietary requirements, etc. And that, I was really passionate about that and pushed that. But it's really hard, specifically when you're trying to do this coming from a corporate world where really you have all the resources that you need and all the help that you need if you're tackling a particular problem versus you're going to startups and it's almost like you're in a desert and it's just you and you're trying to keep your head above water and never fund it yourself. I think that's one of the key things I learned is if you're going to do a startup, don't do it with your own money because it's horrible to see your bank balance go down and nothing's coming in. But anyway, so that was the app. Also did some really interesting thing around B2B, business-to-business marketing, where I took that data and then helped small to medium companies really try to identify where there's options for building healthier alternatives, just again to get people to eat healthier. I think a lot of the things people say, stop eating this or stop eating that, but it's very hard to go cold turkey, where if you can just make these little changes in your diet, then they all kind of add up over time and people just start eating more healthily. And yeah, I was really passionate about that. That's long before we had Chat GPT and all this fantastic AI. We joked, so back in the day where AI actually meant actual intelligence, but we managed to work through there and we did a lot of good stuff. But all that aside, I think with all the advances in machine learning and AI, I think based on the mathematical models we work with, it might actually be worthwhile revisiting that and see if we can breathe some life back into there. And I think that's, I'm hoping there might be some good things. But just kind of going into the experience, I think of the 2.5 years, you kind of learn mostly through your own mistakes. You learn how to not run a business. You learn how to not build something. You learn how to not ask for money, and asking for money in a startup is one of the key things that you need to do. And it's really one of those things that practice makes perfect. But I think it's unless you have a framework or somebody that can help you there, it's very, very hard. But that said, I think that really kind of ignited my passion for the industry, because what you're really doing is you're working on the cutting edge of technology and you're working on new things that might not exist, or you're breaking new ground. And as I say, that it's always the first guy through the door that gets shot. And that really is the case. It's the person who has to prove that it works, and then everybody else comes along and they do that. It's a fantastically interesting industry to be in. And I think from there on, I worked in a lot of other very interesting startups in fintech. We were helping to try to keep people away from payday loans. Agritech, where we were using AI machine learning to model climate changes in South America for rice farmers to help them farm more sustainably. I think you really hate math when you're at school and at college and university, and you realize there's actually such phenomenal implementations of it that's far more interesting. So if anybody wants to not do math, trust me, get through it. The really cool stuff happens when you start working with it. And then also really just medtech, using thermal imagery to try and identify peripheral artery disease in the feet of people with diabetes. Really, really interesting projects that if you can get it over the line, it's going to make a huge difference to a lot of people's lives. A fun fact that people might not know, that the NHS spends more than £1 billion every year just treating diabetic foot ulcers, which is more than they spend on a lot of the top cancers combined. And you wouldn't know that unless you've kind of been there and you've done the research and you've looked at it. So, yeah, that's been my experience in the startup world.
Yeah. And what I love about this, is your openness about the tough realities of the startup world. Because as you say, you may have the best idea, in the world. It may be groundbreaking, but if you haven't got the support around you, the finances or the tools, I can imagine, it's incredibly lonely, and the chance of success can be very, very tough. So thinking about who you go into business with and how you want to build a business, I guess, is very, very important. But what I also love is, by nature, you're talking about ESG, and a thing that we've spoken a lot about in the podcast, and for many of our young listeners, where the environmental, social, and governance are so important now for the future, that food tech, it's a multi-billion-pound business probably, and just similar to, as you covered, agricultural tech, med tech. Technology is the forefront of helping the world. So when you're comparing startups to PLCs, and as we said, you had a really good career at Microsoft. You're working at Pret Manger right now. What would you say are the positives and challenges from the PLC side, working for bigger business?
Um, at the risk of not stepping on anybody's toes, I think it is good to progress your career, and it's a good place to start. I think a lot of people think that you can just go in and you can be the next Zuckerberg or you can be the next Gates. And all due respect to all those gentlemen, they've done fantastically well in the next jobs. But I think for every one of those people, there's probably 2 or 3 million other stories of people that just do not make it in the end. And one of the key things is to really just take your education that you have, that you're passionate about, and go and learn on someone else's dime. And that's the great thing about working in the PLCs and the big companies are you get the support, you get the resources, and there's more than like most time there's people you can learn from. And that's a really fantastic thing about the initial parts of the career is having that ability to go in, learn from these guys, and more, even better, they pay you to learn. They pay you to do the work. There's almost no downside to it, to the point of where you become comfortable enough, where you become the subject matter expert, where people start seeking out your opinion and they're seeking out the way that you do things. And that's really where you want to be, because that gives you the freedom to then branch out into the areas that you're really, really passionate about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's great advice. Social learning is so important now, and as you say, in the early stage of your careers, that is learning. That's learning from others as well as being supported in your education. And so, thinking about where you see the future of technology, and again, we talked a lot about food tech and where that's going, but being such a data-driven person and leading it, how transformational is data in our world today? And can you give us any insights into where you see it's taking us in the future?
I think that it almost surprised me. I thought being in data would be a good place to be. I never had any idea that it was going to grow at the exponential rate that it was. I mean, if you look at everything from apps to television to literally any career to running, if you look at what they're doing in running or Formula One racing, it's all about the data. It's all about there's sensors everywhere, picking up data, analyzing the data, looking at patterns. You can literally go into any industry and there's more data there that you can shake a stick at. And it's really exciting because working with that data and turning that data into knowledge and turning that data into something that you can use to make better decisions. That's really what excites me about data. And I think anybody who works in that space, a lot of people share that same passion. It's not just about the numbers, but it's what you can learn from the numbers. And that really, really, that's the proof in the pudding.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. It literally is where we are. And what really stood out in our earlier part of the conversation, your passion for maths, isn't it?
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof. But I guess one of the myths I like to try and dispel for many of our listeners as well is, that for having a passion in maths or technology engineering, you don't necessarily need to follow the traditional route of a degree and masters in mathematics to excel in technology, do you? As long as you understand the passion and it's within you, I guess.
Absolutely, and again, that's why I this when I say my lack of passion for math, because I really didn't like math at school, and I hated math at university. I never thought I would ever use it in my life. But you're absolutely right. You don't need to be a specialist in that area. It's all about building blocks, finding what you're interested in, and then using those building blocks. And it's all there is. And there's so many resources out there today on the internet, on YouTube. There are training courses. One of the startup proof of concepts that I was working on was analyzing biome data for gut bacteria. I had no clue what it was when I began, and I did some searches on the internet. I typed into ChatGPT, analyzed this file for me, and it did it. And I think that's one of those key things, that there are so many tools out there now that we didn't have growing up. And it's phenomenal what you can do with very little experience in the area, just by listening to people, by listening to the content that they provide, and then building something from that.
Yeah. Again, I really, really agree with you on all of those points. So we're flying through it. Time always just seems to evaporate when we have such interesting conversations. And so let's move on to the last part of the podcast, where we talk about career advice. And I know you've already mentioned, you covered a couple of things already, joining big businesses to learn from and other things. But what one or two other bits of advice could you give our listeners when they're looking at their first job and how to get their foot in the door?
I think to get your foot in the door, find something that you're interested in, find a company that specializes in it, and just let them teach you. That's really the thing. The best way to become a specialist in the area is just to hunker down and get it done. And one of my favorite Richard Branson quotes is that he said that if somebody asks you if you can do something, say yes, and then quickly learn how to do it. And it's fantastic advice, because opportunities present themselves, and if you can grab them, even if you're not necessarily an expert in the area at the time, if you can put in the effort, you can put in the work, you can become that expert, and you can do it. Yeah. So I mean, look, the opportunity is great. The other thing that I really wish somebody had told me early in my career is that build your networks. And that's something, I'm a very technical person, and I tend to think that, you know what, as long as I'm really good at what I do, I don't have to speak to people. And that's not the case. Build your network. When you start off with a job, you're working with a lot of people. They're all going to go on to bigger and better things as they progress through their career. And you're going to go through multiple careers or multiple employments, and so are they. And at some point in time, you're going to look for something, and somebody that you've worked with will know somebody in the industry, or they'll know somebody who's looking. And to be able to go through that network is gold. Because I was going to say, don't use recruiters. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, poor recruiters get swamped with 500 CVs for a particular job, and they don't necessarily have all the bandwidth to make sure that the right person or the best person gets to that job. So if you can build your network, it's a fantastic thing. And with building your network is never burn any bridges. Because also, when you leave a job because you're angry, something's gone wrong, you want to tell everybody about it. And I've learned also that if you don't do that, I've had such good feedback from people who, in situations where I've left a job, and they've helped me get future positions simply because I didn't burn that bridge. So build your network and don't burn bridges. The industry is too small.
Yeah. Well, that's so insightful and such a valid point. In fact, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And networks start at any age, don't they? You know, if any of our listeners are thinking, well, you know, I'm too young to worry about building a network or learning. No, it can literally start almost from school, can't it? But especially within their workplace. So those early years, as you say, can be game changing. Well,
if I can do one last thing, and that kind of ties in with the very first thing when I changed my career from development to training. It's just something interesting there was that I had to take a 25% pay cut, and also I had a fear of public speaking, and both of those. When I had my exit interview with my manager, he said, "I don't quite understand. If you wanted me to pay you less, I would happily oblige." And I said, "No. The reason I'm doing it is because I want to get exposure to the technology." And this is something that I cannot also stress enough, is that whenever you can, try and do something that's outside of your comfort zone, because you'd be so surprised what you learn and what you do if you just do something that you potentially didn't think you could do. And really, just to kind of round that off, another one of my favorite quotes, somebody once said that people love to be in their grooves. The only difference between a groove and a grave is the depth. Find something interesting that's outside of your comfort zone and give it a shot.
I love that quote. What a great quote to finish on. And so, yeah, well, thank you, Edward. Great to have you on the podcast, and to our listeners, that is another episode of our Future Tech podcast. As many of you know, it's shared on the STEM Ambassador Association, as well as on majorgroup.com /podcast. So it's just to me to say it one more time, Edward, thank you so much for being a guest.
Much appreciated. Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, that is another episode of Future Tech. Thank you.